On October 29th, Mr. Fidler was assigned to the USS Wallace L. Lind DD-703. Getting his placement was easy, however getting on the ship was another story. Instead of waiting for the ship to return to Japan, Mr. Fidler and a few others had to chase it down through multiple transfers to various ships. They left Sasebo on November 3rd at 1600 hours and headed to Wonsan, Korea. During this trip, they heard on the radio that there was an attempted assassination of President Truman. On November 7th, they arrived in Wonsan Harbor only to discover that the Lind wasn't there. They had to keep up the pursuit and boarded the USS Hank DD-702, which took them up the northern coast of Korea, where they finally found the USS Lind at 2100 hours. What was it like boarding the ship in the darkness?
Well, it wasn't too much fun. First of all, I was only 120 pounds, and I had a sea bag that was about 100, maybe even more, almost my same weight. And Hank got me down into their boat and took me over to the Wallace Lind, and they had a rope ladder there that I had to climb up, holding this big sea bag. But
I can only imagine.
And it was in the dark.
I can only imagine how difficult that was to carry that and climb.
Yeah, I wasn't used to that. But I made it. Well, after 2 months back in the Navy, I finally found my ship and was on board the Wallace Lind DD-703. They greeted us with coffee and sandwiches and seemed glad to see us. They were a little short of men, and so far it seemed like a very nice ship with a friendly crew, much better than the Mansfield. The captain and the commanding officer of the Lind was Captain E.B. Carson, and the executive officer was Lieutenant Commander R.C. Marquardt. After being on the Lind a couple days, I came to the conclusion that the food was good, and so was the company. Most of the fellows were from the area of Norfolk, Virginia, and when we went back to the States, we would probably go to Norfolk. Maybe I would get lucky and get transferred to the Lind. After all.
Did you meet anybody special on board the Lind?
On board, I met a fellow from Reading, Pennsylvania, by the name of Warren Moon. He lived in the 1100 block of Locust Street, and his wife was expecting to have their second child sometime next month. It was a reserve. He was a reserve who came back in the Navy September 8th through Philadelphia. It sure was nice to have someone to talk to about home. We had been at sea most of the time since we arrived in Korea. For a few nights, our job was to fire illuminated shells over the enemy lines to light up their position so our troops could better detect them. From November 10th to the 17th, we did a lot of patrolling up and down the coast, and once in a while we anchored in Wonsan Harbor. Sometimes we fired on the enemy along the coastal highway, as well as at the trains running along the tracks near the coast. One day we fired at a railroad tunnel after the train entered the tunnel, and then we were able to close both ends with our shells firing, trapping the train inside. Every once in a while they sent up to Chongjin in northern Korea, when we got there, we had to go through a narrow channel, past a buoy, and then into a small harbor. we lay we lay out in the harbor and fire various types of shells into the town to start fires, and then we left. We did this every couple of days, and the enemy must have noticed that we always passed near the buoy at the end of the channel. So while we were gone, they set up a 6-inch gun in the mountains and zeroed in on the buoy. The next time we came back, they were waiting for us, and we didn't come alone. That time, an Australian destroyer came with us. We went into the channel first and right past the buoy, and nothing happened. But when the Australian destroyer passed the buoy, the enemy fired and had 2 direct hits on the destroyer, killing a couple men. It didn't take long for both of our ships to zero in on the enemy gun and knock it out. But I guess we learned a lesson, although this was the only entrance to the harbor.
Wow.
Wow. You learn something every day.
Yeah, not to repeat your same movements, especially when at war. Or they might get wise to your tricks.
I think my Lucky Loy switched over to Lucky Lynn.
I know. Speaking of which, so the Loy was a DE and then was an APD. Now, what's the DD stand for in the Wallace L. Lind DD?
This was a destroyer, not a destroyer escort. It was a bigger ship, had a lot more guns. The Loy, we only had 3 single 5-inch guns, and the Lynn had 3 double 5-inch guns that were side by side, and when they fired, they could do a lot of damage.
So how did the Korean conflict compare with your experience during World War II, as far as the combat and so forth?
On the Loy, off Okinawa, we were in so many air raids, but off Korea, we had an air raid once in a while, but not very many. And when I was called back into Korea, they said they needed sonarmen. And I got there, and the whole time I was there, I think we only ever heard of one submarine being around.
So,
so that was a little bit different.
Yeah, they didn't necessarily need you as badly as they said they did. And I see that there is a lighter note. You and your buddy Moan decided to grow mustaches.
Yeah, it was nice to talk about the past. And since both his wife was pregnant and mine too, it was a little different.
What about the temperature? Was it, I know it was pretty hot in Japan, but what was it like in Korea?
Well, if you look at the shore, it was snow-covered, and it was pretty cold.
Did you ever feel that on the ship?
Oh, yeah. One morning, we woke up, and the outside was, the whole ship was just covered with ice. And
snowball.
I guess we're not showing pictures on the podcast, but we had snow all over a track and ice all over. That morning we had to chop it all off.
And shovel it.
Yeah, and throw the big pieces over the side.
Wow.
On there, it helped with the navigation. It was a problem with the navigation, too.
Yeah. And one night you ran into a fellow that also lived in Franklin, North Carolina.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
So what was the Lind assigned to handle?
Well, we then found out the Chinese communist troops were within 20 miles of Hungnam and were advancing. Our Marines were slowly retreating from up north and headed down into Hungnam. We moved in closer to the beach so that we could furnish as much fire support as possible in the event that they had to evacuate our troops. For a while, around December 12th, we patrolled with the USS Massey, maintaining the blockade on the northern patrol around Songjin. We traveled up and down the coast and did a lot of shore bombarding of targets that the shore spotters told us by radio to fire at. We were usually up half of the night firing at the enemy. We blew up a railroad bridge and some boxcars, fired on enemy concentrations, and inspected sampans.
What are sampans?
They were little Japanese boats, and you'd never know
what was in them. Okay.
One piece of good news was that Moan and I started to raise a beard to go along with our mustache. On December 17th, the USS Hank relieved us of our bumming duties, and we headed back to Hungnam, where we arrived later in the day. We were all happy to receive some mail when we arrived. Back before I caught up with the Lynn and was floating around on the Mansfield, Dixie, and Miss Pillion, I wasn't getting my mail regular, if at all. Evidently, Betty sent a letter of complaint to the Navy. With the mail that I received that day, I received a letter from the Commander's Service Forces Pacific Fleet. The subject of the letter was mail delivery. They sent me a postcard with it and instructed me to send it back to them to assist in a continued mail handling time study. It took 6 weeks for me to get that card. That ought to have told them something.
Was that delay in the mail happening to everyone else or just you?
I'm not sure. I never checked.
Okay. Well, something big was going to happen soon. It was the Hungnam evacuation. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, from December 18th to 22nd, we were very busy. Every day at dusk, all ships were assigned several targets and instructed to fire upon them throughout the night. We anchored in as close as we could safely be and fired a couple shells every minute or so, just enough that the enemy was pinned down and couldn't move around. The Army and Marines had a perimeter set up around the town of Hungnam to protect those inside it as well as to keep out the enemy. Every day, thousands of civilians were evacuated out of Hungnam, and the Marines that were retreating from the north were evacuated when they got there. In the meantime, we held the perimeter to keep the enemy from getting to town. It was the Army's job to hold the perimeter during the day while we went out to sea and met the ammunition ship. We then loaded up ammunition all day at sea, running side by side with the ship in near zero temperatures and a lot of times in high winds. Each day we got back to port in time to anchor and were assigned new targets and started firing at the enemy again for the whole night. If we didn't have the watch at night, we tried to get some sleep and hoped that the gun they were firing wasn't over where we were sleeping. So far, about a week, we didn't get much sleep. We were part of the United Nations naval vessels that were established a steel curtain around the shrinking defense perimeter encircling Hungnam. In coordination with the carrier-based air attacks, the pinpoint bombardment had made a no man's land of the outer edges of the defense arc, as enemy concentrations, rear junctions, and vehicular traffic were pounded day and night by us and other naval ships. On December 23rd, we received the following message from the Shorefire Control Party of the 3rd Infantry Division ashore. The Big Wheels want to thank you guys for the swell job of naval gunfire in the past few days and hope you can keep it up. The boys on the front lines want to thank you too. By that time, over 250,000 civilians were evacuated, as well as most of the Marines and soldiers. Each day, as they evacuated, they moved the perimeter smaller and smaller until they weren't holding much of the town anymore. It was only a matter of time, and finally, as dawn of December 24th broke cold and clear, and while most of the world began their holiday festivities, a relative quiet tenseness hung over the harbor and defense perimeter of Hungnam, Korea. It was D-Day, the remnant of troops that for days had been methodically effecting their withdrawal into the small semicircle of protection within the harbor area was evacuated. The great armada of Navy ships had been deployed about the harbor like so many chessmen to cover the evacuating United States troops, and long before daylight, in the protection of darkness, all ships not participating in the evacuation had silently moved out of the harbor. The evacuation had been carefully planned, and every ship had a specific function to perform, from the mighty battleship Missouri and the huge transport down to the small PF boats and LCMs. Early in the morning, the small landing craft and amphibious boats began beach-to-ship evacuation. Overhead carrier-based planes began making attacks on enemy concentrations. The air resounded from the boom of the big guns from the cruisers St. Paul and Rochester. The Lynn, Hank, Sperry, Massey, Zellers, and other destroyers lying close to the beach kept up a continuous barrage of fire on strategic points. At about 10 o'clock, the landing craft started the final evacuation. LSDs beached and swallowed large quantities of men and equipment in true Higgins fashion. Tugs stood by to aid where needed as transports loaded and moved out of the harbor.
What happened next?
A little after noon really began in earnest. Between 1330 and 1630, the Lynn fired 555 rounds of AAC, and that was really kicking them out. Empty brass shells cases littered the deck. Fixtures blew loose from bulkheads. Paint scales were everywhere, and tire handling crews kept passing ammunition as the Lynn kept kicking them out. At 1630, the demolition squads finished blowing up the dock facilities and everything else that was on benefit of the enemy. Then it was time to leave, and one by one the ships fell in line and joined the long possession of the Moose South. Old Jolly Wally, with burned muzzles and littered decks, was third from the last to leave, and as she cleared the harbor, Hungnam was nothing but a flaming mass of destruction.
Whoa.
Christmas Eve was a relief to everyone, knowing that the evacuation was over and that it was a success. We left Hungnam with the cruiser USS Rochester and proceeded to Sasebo, Japan. The Rochester sent a message that we would not arrive to Sasebo until Tuesday morning, the day after Christmas. Then our captain sent a message to the Rochester asking whether we couldn't possibly reach Sasebo by Christmas Day. The Rochester sent back a message saying, "There is a Santa Claus after all. We will arrive in Sasebo on Christmas Day." So we were full speed ahead and arrived in Sasebo late in the afternoon of Christmas Day. Merry Christmas.
Wow. That is quite a incredible day.
Yeah, that sure was.
Where were you stationed during the evacuation?
Well, I hate to tell you this, but I was in the sonar shack all night when they were firing the front 5-inch guns right next to the sonar shack. And at midnight, when my watch was over, I went back to my bunk, which was back under the fantail. And I was going to sleep. And right then they switched guns to right over where I was going to be sleeping. And I think that's why I have hearing aids now.
No rest for the weary. Wow. Wow, what awful positioning you could have had during this. And there wasn't much action in the sonar shack.
That's bad planning, I think.
Yeah. Whew. Well.
You can't always be lucky.
No. And this isn't even the end of Korea. We still have more to talk about in next week's episode. Well, this is Marley and the Ping Jockey signing off.
Bye-bye.